Good afternoon, class. Welcome to Chapter 17 on food safety. This is a very extensive chapter, and I think most of this should be used as a reference versus to memorize everything because there's just so many issues, bacteria, pathogens, viruses, etc., that we're going to be talking about today. But this is practical information that each and every one of you can use to help keep yourself safe and help keep your food supply safe. All right, so contaminated foods and water are the cause of so many diseases worldwide, and this has actually led to millions of outbreaks and cases of illness. Most of the time, this comes from bacteria, viruses, and different pathogens. However, it's also possible that foodborne additives can cause disease. Some of the recent viruses and pathogens, bacteria in the news. So Norovirus. In 2012, there were 16 outbreaks on different cruise ships. Hepatitis A, frozen berries, recently caused 113 people to be hospitalized. Well, 113 sick, 50 hospitalized. Salmonella was found in jalapenos, Serrano peppers, and peanut butter. This was over 34 states and caused illness in 224 people. Clostridium, this is just a silly one to me. This was one single case of Clostridium, and it was because somebody ate stew that had been sitting out at room temperature for 3 days, which don't do that. E. coli is found in water wells, spinach and sprouts. Spinach and sprouts are particularly susceptible to E. coli because they have such a large surface area and it's really difficult to wash them properly. And then Ciguatera, this is a bacteria that comes from algae in the sea, and then fish can eat the algae and become contaminated. So this was found in barracuda that some crew members had been eating. Who is affected? So 48 million illnesses, 128,000 hospitalizations, and 3,000 deaths. And this is per year, averages per year. Certain groups are more susceptible than others. Anybody with a suppressed immune system, such as liver disease, HIV, diabetes, or cancer, anybody after surgery, infants and children because their immune systems are immature, and pregnant women. We're going to talk about some that are specific to pregnant women. Foodborne illness usually occurs at home, and sometimes you don't even know you have a foodborne illness. You just might think you've got the stomach bug or you're a little bit sick. And one of the reasons it does occur commonly at home is because you can't see foodborne illness before it happens. You don't always know that a food is contaminated because you can't see these tiny bacteria, and sometimes they don't cause enough spoilage odors or growths of molds or off colorings to detect them. In fact, most of the time, not just sometimes. Luckily, our government does have some agencies that help protect us from or help make sure our food supply is safe. One of them is the USDA, the United States Department of Agriculture, and they have quality standards for meat, poultry, milk, grains, produce, and eggs. They help create what's called the safe handling label, which is shown in this picture here. And this label is usually found on protein foods such as meats and fishes. And it will tell you how to cook this and how to make sure that it's safe. Usually the newer labels I've seen have actually had the temperature that you're supposed to cook it to. And some of them even say how hot you're supposed to heat the oven to. EPA is the Environmental Protection Agency. They help regulate pesticides, set safe pesticide levels in food, regulate water quality, and improve all pesticides that are used in our food supply. Additional agencies are the Food and Drug Administration, or the FDA. They will regulate seafood, they regulate interstate trade, they inspect food processing facilities, and they have standards for specific foods. The CDC, or Centers for Disease Control, helps promote food safety and responds to emergencies for foodborne illness. They also help quarantine foods if quarantines need to be set up. And they have the National Program for Prevention and Control of Foodborne and Other Diseases. National Marine Fisheries Program. This is a voluntary program for seafood inspection, and you can actually have a mark saying that your seafood was inspected, an official label on the seafood. And then state and local governments are involved in milk safety, any foods produced within their region, as well as inspection of restaurants. So, for example, this is County of Los Angeles and rating the restaurant kitchen. Why is foodborne illness so common? So, because food is a great environment. Food is usually moist, it contains water, it contains proteins, it contains sugar. We don't typically eat a ton of acidic foods, and bacteria like to grow in these conditions. Sometimes the food is warm or room temperature, and it's just really an optimal growth environment for bacteria. Refrigeration sometimes stops bacterial growth, but not always. Sometimes it just slows growth, meaning nothing will continue to grow in the refrigerator or it will grow more slowly, but it doesn't necessarily kill the bacteria. Production of foods in bulk can lead to food outbreaks because sometimes facilities that produce things in bulk, those things are distributed all across the country, and say there was a contamination in the central processing plant. If that spread throughout the country, it could potentially cause issues in multiple different states or counties. Other reasons for foodborne illness. We're getting more food from other countries, and the regulations on this are less strict. We used to get more kind of raw or unprocessed foods from other countries, and then we could be sure that the processing occurred in our own borders under our own conditions of safety and sanitation. However, now we're getting more ready-to-eat foods, meaning we don't do any further processing once we receive these. And so that can be an issue. Use of antibiotics in animal feeds. The antibiotics, the reason we're afraid of these is because we're worried that antibiotic-resistant bacteria are going to develop, or antibiotic-resistant pathogens, and that humans could be susceptible to them. Also, the reason we are potentially getting more foodborne illness is that not necessarily that we're getting more, but that we can recognize more, meaning we have better technology to diagnose and identify different pathogens when somebody gets sick than we ever have. Food safety. So how do we keep our foods safe? There are many different preservation methods. Maybe you can think of some older ones. In this picture here, I believe these are either some lamb legs or pork legs, and these are being dried as well as salted, so drying and salting. Smoking is an older method. Even adding a high amount of sugar, for example, jellies and jams, are relatively preserved products. Today we have some more advanced preservation techniques, and many of these you may be familiar with. We will talk a little bit about irradiation because I don't think this is a household term. So, irradiation. In irradiation, very short radio waves are used to control pathogens. And so radio waves pass through the food. These radio waves are not harmful, and there's no radioactive residue left behind. The food isn't radioactive or anything like that. However, the radiation is strong enough to break some DNA, break some chemical bonds, and destroy bonds between cells. And so it can disrupt many pathogens. It's commonly used on fresh fruit, veggies, meat, spices, shell eggs. And if a food is irradiated, it has to contain this green label showing that it has been irradiated. All right, foodborne illness. So there are two different types of foodborne illness. There's foodborne infection and foodborne intoxication. Foodborne infection happens when bacteria invade your intestinal wall and produce a toxin, meaning you eat bacteria on the foods, and within your body they produce a toxin. Foodborne intoxication happens when the bacteria have already produced that toxin inside the food. So when you eat the food not only contains bacteria, but it contains a toxin that they've created. And because that food contains the toxin already, you're not waiting around for bacteria to produce it. And with a foodborne intoxication, illness will occur at a much faster rate. Some types of contaminants. So bacteria contaminants are the most prevalent and pathogenic types of contaminants to our food source out there. Many of you have heard of Salmonella, where while there are many strains of Salmonella, only 3 strains are mostly responsible for foodborne illness, results in over 1 million cases a year. And the majority of these foodborne illnesses come from eggs or egg products. And you can also get salmonella from touching reptiles. So turtles and lizards and snakes actually sometimes carry salmonella on your skin. So that's why if you've handled those animals, it's important to wash your hands and sanitize. Campylobacter. So Campylobacter is found in raw and undercooked meat and poultry, and it's estimated that over half of raw meat has Campylobacter contamination. Campylobacter is responsible for over 800,000 infections per year, and it can also be found in contaminated waters. E. coli. There are many strains of E. coli. Some of them are more pathogenic than others. One particularly pathogenic strain is the O157H7 strain, and this particular strain is particularly pathogenic because it can cause kidney failure and hemolytic anemia, which is when your red blood cells actually burst and are destroyed, and this can be fatal. There were 73,000 cases on average per year, and sometimes this is found in juice, milk, produce such as lettuce, spinach, and sprouts. Shigella. Shigella comes from food contaminated with bacteria from food handlers with poor hygiene, meaning a food handler has used the bathroom, not washed their hands, and then touches your food. And you have fecal oral transmission, meaning from their butt to your mouth. Sorry to say that like that, but it's true. From their feces to your oral cavity. Maybe that will help you remember. As far as Shigella infections go, there is up to 500,000 cases per year of this, and sometimes this is known as traveler's diarrhea. Additional bacteria contaminants. So Staph aureus. Staph is a bacteria that lives on our skin. It lives on our nasal cavities as well. So potentially if you are picking your nose and not washing your hands, or sneezing into your hands and then not washing your hands, Staph aureus could get on your hands, and then if you go touch food, it could get on the food. It multiplies very rapidly with contaminated foods and especially at room temperature. So this is why heating leftovers hot or keeping foods very hot or cooling foods very rapidly is so important. Clostridium perfringens is found in mostly meats, but also some Mexican foods. There are close to 1 million people a year infected with this particular bacteria, and it's usually mild, causing some diarrhea or abdominal pain. Listeria monocytogenes is found in unpasteurized milks and cheeses, raw meats, undercooked vegetables, ready-to-eat deli meats, so example, your sliced ham or your sliced turkey from the deli, hot dogs, and refrigerated smoked fish, for example, salmon. And this is a particularly dangerous one because this Listeria bacteria can cross the placenta. And if a woman is pregnant and comes in contact with this Listeria bacteria, it's possible that it could lead to stillbirth or miscarriage of the baby. One of the problems with this Listeria bacteria is it does continue to grow at refrigeration temps. So some of these things like the cheeses and the deli meats and the hot dogs that you think, oh, they're safe, they're in my refrigerator, they wouldn't necessarily be safe if they were contaminated with Listeria. When I was pregnant, some of these were foods that I liked, and so I had a couple strategies. I made baked brie a few times because brie cheese is one of the cheese no-nos. So I baked it in the oven and then I used my food thermometer to check the temperature of it. I also would heat my deli meats. So I know that maybe doesn't sound as appetizing as nice cold deli meats, but I would heat them up in the microwave for just a little bit, and that can help kill some of this bacteria. Clostridium. So Clostridium botulinum can cause botulism toxin, or produces botulism toxin that can cause botulism, and botulism leads to paralysis rather quickly. This is most commonly found in incorrectly canned foods, usually the result of home cooking. But another reason, or where you might see these, is in a can that's been dented or a can that's bloated. This is why you would always want to throw out cans like that, because it's possible that bacteria have had a chance to get in. This particular bacteria lives in an anaerobic environment, meaning without oxygen, and it thrives in these types of conditions. Infants are especially prone to disease from botulism bacteria, and sometimes botulism spores are found in honey. Adult digestive system can manage these botulism spores in honey, but an infant's digestive system is less mature, and so you don't want to give infants any honey. Bacterial growth. So, bacteria prefers to grow between 40 and 140 degrees. This is considered what's called the danger zone. I have seen as low as 35 degrees, I have seen as low as 135 degrees as far as the danger zone goes. They're always kind of updating these temperatures. But you want to heat foods hotter than this to help kill bacteria, and you want to store foods colder than this. Viruses. So viruses are found all over nature, widely found in nature, but they can only reproduce once they've invaded their host, or in our case, our cells, our human cells. And norovirus is the most common virus leading to foodborne illness. There are 20 million cases a year, resulting in 70,000 hospitalizations and over 800 deaths. Long-term care facilities, these are like nursing homes and assisted living centers, and so the elderly are primarily affected by this type of a disease. Hepatitis A, or Hep A. So hepatitis A is a virus that can be passed from one person who has poor hygiene onto the food supply and then into another person. So it's typically found in foods that are not cooked, such as salads, pastries, contaminated shellfish, sandwiches, etc. It can take quite a long time to develop and be recognized, so it would be very, very hard to identify the source of this virus, potentially. And children and young adults are most susceptible. You can get vaccinated for this, and often it's recommended if you're traveling to other countries to get this vaccination so that you can build up immunity if you were to be exposed. Parasites. So parasites are living organisms, and they either live on other organisms or in other organisms, and those other organisms are considered their host. They're more common in tropical and warm areas with high moisture levels and poor sanitation. There are many of them that infect humans, and if you want to read more about them, you can do so in your book. Food additives. So food additives can be intentionally added to food or unintentionally added to food, such as in the case of contaminant. And generally, when we intentionally add a food additive, we're trying to either improve its flavor, improve its texture, improve the way the food looks, improve the color, or improve its shelf stability, its lifespan, prevent it from spoilage, prevent it from bacteria, etc. And really, the introduction of food additives is something that has just enabled our food supply to grow so widely and for us to produce foods that last so long. I mean, I have foods in my pantry that have been there for years, and I don't worry about them going bad, where even just 100 years ago, food spoilage leading to starvation or malnutrition was a serious concern. Gras List. This should actually be capital GRAS, capital G, capital R, capital A, capital S. And the Gras List stands for foods that are generally recognized as safe. This list was created in 1958 from foods that were commonly used in our food supply, and that our government felt that those manufacturers did not need to prove safety of those foods because they were so widely used and consumed, and no notable negative effects had been observed. This list was reevaluated since then, and some things have actually been removed from the list and some things have been added. Things that have been removed are red dyes. They had been found to be carcinogens, as well as Cycla Mates. These were both things that we thought was safe but turned out not to be. Salt. So salt is a controversial one. Salt is on the list of foods that are generally recognized as safe, but there are many lobbying committees, such as the American Heart Association, that would argue that salt is absolutely not safe. And the association with salt and high blood pressure, as well as heart disease, is a significant risk and reason for it to be removed from the list. Are synthetic chemicals harmful? So if they have a synthetic food additive, does that mean it's bad? My answer would be no, absolutely not necessarily. You could ask the opposite question. Does natural mean safe? And again, my answer will be no, absolutely not necessarily. Nothing about a natural product makes it intrinsically safe. Just think of all of the natural poisons and toxins out there in the world. I mean, even salt, which is natural, is toxic in super high amounts. Caffeine could be toxic at super high amounts. There are so many things that are natural that are absolutely, definitely not safe in very high amounts. Plants produce their own toxins, and they produce toxins in response to stress. And so what they've found is sometimes a plant that is sprayed with a pesticide will produce less of its own plant toxins. And that could potentially be a good thing. So looking at foods for food safety, some additives are tested by the FDA using animal studies, and you are not allowed to use a food additive that causes cancer. This was called the Delaney Clause. This happened in 1958, and it prohibits intentionally adding to a food that may cause cancer at any level of exposure. FDA cannot ban what they cannot control. Pesticide residues, molds, toxins, and industrial chemicals. These are all listed here because these can become contaminants in food, and you can't really regulate contaminants. I mean, you can try, you can say can't contain more than, but it may be really difficult to detect. The blank agency approves the use of food additives. Hopefully you said the FDA. So kind of what I just said on the last slide, additives cannot be used to hide defects of food. They cannot be used to disguise ingredients, to deceive customers, or replace good manufacturing practices. And they cannot be added if they are cancer-causing in humans or animals. This is an example of natural not being safe. So all these components listed on these slides are produced naturally by plants and animals, and they are absolutely toxic. So for example, safrole is a compound produced by sassafras and nutmeg, and it inhibits calcium. So it inhibits calcium in high doses. Oh, sorry, I'm looking at my notes. Sometimes I write Ca, and Ca stands for calcium. It also stands for cancer. So what I meant to say was safrole can cause cancer at high doses. Solanine is found in potatoes, and it's indicated when a potato develops this kind of green coloring on the outside of the potato. So you would want to avoid a potato that has a lot of that green coloring. And solanine toxin inhibits neurotransmitters. There are many different mushroom toxins out there. Some of them cause dizziness. That's something pretty benign. Some of them cause neurological diseases. I actually knew a patient who went into liver failure because of eating some mushrooms. Avidin is a protein found in egg whites and reduces biotin absorption. And so biotin deficiency could happen if you were eating a lot of raw egg whites. Tetrodotoxin is something that comes from the pufferfish. This causes respiratory paralysis. Oxalic acid is in spinach, strawberry, and sesame seeds, and oxalic acids reduce the absorption of different minerals such as iron, calcium, magnesium, zinc, and copper. And then herbal teas have something called senna in them, which senna in high amounts can cause diarrhea and even liver damage. So natural does not necessarily mean safe. It can be safe, but it's no guarantee. Caffeine, I kind of mentioned this already. This is natural. This is a stimulant. This is a drug. You can overdose and die from caffeine. It actually just happened to a young boy who consumed 2 energy drinks, 1 Mountain Dew, and potentially something else, and probably had a pre-existing heart issue. Where do we get our caffeine? Most of our caffeine comes from coffee. There are actually a lot of studies on the beneficial health benefits of coffee. So don't get me wrong, I'm not knocking coffee here. I'm just saying people should be somewhat cautious with caffeine. As far as how caffeine is consumed, you can look at how it's consumed. So coffee, tea, soda, chocolate. Is it consumed alone? No. What do you add to your coffee? Well, many people add milk. Many people add a sweetener. What if you get a frappuccino or a pumpkin spice latte? That has a lot of milk, a lot of sugar, a lot of fat, a lot of calories. Soda, high fructose corn syrup with your caffeine. Chocolate, to me, really not so bad, but you could also have milk fats, milk solids, and different ingredients depending on the type or the origin of the chocolate. Pesticides. So pesticides can actually be synthetic or natural, and pesticides are things that are sprayed on crops to ward off pests. There is concern that this pesticide residue will still occur on the plants that we eat, such as on the surface of the leaves of the plants, or perhaps the peels of plants or the skins of plants like apples or strawberries, and that pesticide might have harmful effects to human life. Another concern with pesticides is that it can kill off certain insects, and this can severely disrupt the food chain. For example, spiders are predators of other pests, and if pesticides kill the spiders won't be eating the smaller bugs out there, and we may need even more pesticides to kill those. So any substance intended to prevent, destroy, repel, or mitigate a pest. Pesticides include insecticides, herbicides, fungicides, and rodenticides. Insecticides are against insects, herbicides are against herbs, fungicides are against fungus, and rodenticides are against rodents such as gophers or mice or rats. And like I said, they could be natural or synthetic, they could be chemical, they could be bacterial. We use a lot of them each year, and they may have intended as well as unintended actions. It all depends on the safety of them, how they're applied, when they're applied, how much of them resides in the soil or the water runoff or the fruits and vegetables that we eat or the animals that feed from those soils. They are big cost-saving commodities, and for every $1 spent on pesticides to increase crops, $4 are saved in crop yields. So they can highly increase crop yields as well as reduce crop spoilage and crop destruction by pests, not by pesticides. Different areas that regulate them. So the FDA, the EPA, Food Safety Committee, and the USDA will look at pesticides, and there are certain levels for each pesticide that are considered allowed on different foods, and they will ensure that these levels are low. If you are exposed to a lot of pesticides, say potentially you are a field worker who has to spray the pesticides on the crops and you don't have any safety equipment, no mask, no goggles, no gloves, nothing like that, it can lead to cancer and birth defects. They've found lymph cancer, genital cancer, brain cancer, digestive cancers, and sterility all associated with pesticide exposures. However, the amounts found on most of our everyday foods are pretty low, and so exposure at these high levels to cause birth defects and cancer is relatively low. This is one reason, though, one of many, that it's important to eat a variety of foods. If you are eating a variety of foods, you are less likely to be exposed to the same pesticide over and over again. And so potentially the amount of each individual pesticide you're exposed to is smaller, where if you only ate one fruit or one vegetable, you would potentially be getting a little bit more of that specific pesticide, whatever was used on that crop. Okay, so how can we pick fruits and veggies that are pesticide free, or which fruits and veggies should we pick that are pesticide free? So there is a nonprofit organization. It's called the Environmental Working Group. You can check out their webpage. They are a health research and advocacy organization, and they produce these flyers every year. This is a slightly old one, but it doesn't change much, and they're called the Dirty Dozen and the Clean 15. And the Dirty Dozen are usually plants that they recommend buying organic because these plants may have higher levels of pesticides on them. I will say, though, that there has not been any research to show that these pesticide levels on the plants actually cause problems in humans, because if there was, the FDA would pull them from the market. These are the clean 13. So you had the Dirty Dozen. These are the clean 13 or clean 15 in this particular case. Sometimes it's 13, sometimes it's 15. And so these fruits and veggies are veggies that will have low pesticide residue, and you would not necessarily want or need to buy organic. What exactly is organic? So organic does not use pesticides. It would rely on biological pest management. So for example, if you were growing grapes and there was a lot of weeds growing between your grapevines, you could have goats come and eat those weeds. Potentially, if you had a lot of aphids, you could release ladybugs. The ladybugs would eat the aphids if the aphids were eating the leaves. Also relies on crop rotation, and this helps maintain healthy soils as well as nutrient-dense plants. Fertilizers, pesticides, hormones, antibiotics, genetic engineering, and irradiation cannot be used. However, manure as a fertilizer actually can be used. So no synthetic of anything. Meats, animals must be able to graze outside and consume only organic food. So an organic cow or organic beef is a cow that's consumed organic wheat or organic corn or whatever type of feed they're giving the cow. And the sales have increased, but they still represent a pretty small fraction of the food supply. In the 1990s, a label was created to recognize organic foods or foods that contain 95% organic ingredients. This is what the label looks like. If a food has 70% organic ingredients, but does not quite meet that 90% organic ingredients or 95%, it can say made with organic ingredients, but it cannot have this label. So this label is for 95% or above only. Organics and health. So organic foods contain less pesticides. True. However, science has not yet seen that this is any benefit to humans. A lot of speculation that yes, of course it would be beneficial to have less pesticides, but we don't have any large-scale studies yet that say yes. So that's that. Most organic foods do not have any better nutrient content than non-organic foods, or if they do, the level is so small and insignificant that it's relatively negligible. I mentioned manure. Manure is poop. Poop comes from the rear end of animals. And if you remember when we were talking about bacteria, bacteria is usually found in the rear end. So if we want to put poop on our plants and then expect the plants to break through that soil that's covered in poop, it is possible, or some people might worry, that those plants, if not washed, could be exposed to any sort of disease that was in the poop. That being said, manure is a very good fertilizer. It actually brings a lot of nutrients to the soil and the plants that grow in it and can be relatively safe, but there's always that kind of question mark. Natural, if you see the word natural on a food, guess what it means? It means absolutely nothing. So there's no regulation. In utopia, it should mean it came from natural ingredients with minimal processing, but it doesn't necessarily mean any of that. There is no organization, no government agency that regulates the term natural. So just about anybody can throw that on their product as a marketing scheme, and it means absolutely nothing. Sustainability of foods. So there is a lot to read about sustainability of foods. And in fact, there's an entire degree you can get on sustainability of foods. I think eating sustainable foods is very important and will continue to be more important in our future if we want a future. Some of the reasons or some of the strategies people discuss to eat sustainably would be buying local, buying in season, either cutting out meat or significantly reducing your meat and dairy intakes. Talk to the farmers, ask where this food came from, things like that. Buying only what you need so that there's less food waste. Seafood is a big one. We think of our oceans as these huge bodies of water just full of life. And at one point in time, they were that. However, we are overfishing many of our oceans. And seafood is just the fish, the seafood, they're just not being able to regenerate their populations as quick as we're consuming them. There's also a lot of waste in the fishing industry. Not all fishermen, but it is definitely a wasteful collection of food, you could say. So certain fish species, as well as certain fishing locations and certain fishing methods, are considered more sustainable, less harmful to the environment, and better able to preserve our fish populations. And so you can look for different labels on fish that you buy, as well as ask grocery stores about these products. Preventing foodborne illness. So there's a whole section on your book about this that you can read about on your own. I do recommend you read it on your own. It's very, very helpful information as far as everyday life goes. Nobody wants to get foodborne illness. You don't want to give your family members foodborne illness or your friends foodborne illness. And so there's lots of tips you can follow to help reduce your risk. One of them is pictured here. This is using a meat thermometer. And using a meat thermometer is really the only way to tell that you have heated your meat to a significant temperature, hot enough to kill bacteria that might be common to that particular type of meat. All right, so what we've talked about today, and thank you for listening.